Welcome to Rabble Radio. I'm your host, Wayne McPhail. In this episode, I chat with Andrew Barnsley, an executive producer of the Canadian comedy show Schitt's Creek. We discuss how and why small-town Canada has found a place in the hearts of audiences around the world. Next up, a walking tour of the historical kitchen garden of Dundurn Castle in Hamilton, Ontario. We learn about how 2 acres of produce sustained the family of Sir Allan Napier McNab, a premier of the United Canadas in the mid-1800s. So, huge gardens and small towns all in one episode. By the way, if you want to read Harrowsmith magazine instead of listen to it, you can subscribe to the print version online at harrowsmithmag.com. And you can find Harrowsmith magazine on selected newsstands across Canada. But for now, settle in for the next half hour of Harrowsmith Radio. The comedy series Schitt's Creek is a sitcom phenom. Over its 6 seasons, the show, set in the fictional small Ontario town of Schitt's Creek, hard by the bigger small town of Elmsdale, attracted a passionate international audience. Its final emotional and heartfelt season hit the streaming service just as COVID hit that audience hard. Andrew Barnsley, an executive producer on the show, along with show creators Dan and Eugene Levy, says the epidemic of isolation is one of the reasons for the show's unparalleled success. But he argues there's something about small towns like Schitt's Creek that resonates with folks looking to reconnect with simple values, family, and the ties that bind, even when the going gets tough. Here's our conversation about a huge success and small towns. Andrew, thanks very much for joining us. I want to talk a lot about Schitt's Creek and about small towns. But before we do that, I want to talk about big business. So you were the executive producer on the show. Can you explain to folks very briefly what an executive producer does? It strikes me you're sort of in between the business side and the creative side. Can you sort of expand on that a bit?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me, Wayne. It's nice to have the opportunity to talk about these things. I'm very passionate about all of this, and whenever I have a chance to speak about comedy and film and television in Canada, I'm happy to do it. So I appreciate that. You know, executive producer, I'm sure you went to go find a definition of what it was, and it was probably 5 or 10 different definitions that came up. But for me, the definition that I live in is really the person or the group of people who connect the creative with the business. So I work very closely with the creative teams on shows. In the case of Schitt's Creek, that's Eugene and Dan, to help bring the show to market. We figure out sort of buyers that we'd like to target, and then the executive producer connects the creative pieces to the business pieces.
And certainly for Schitt's Creek, I mean, it has done phenomenal work internationally, right? It's done phenomenal distribution internationally, and that's through your distributor then. And you would have dealt with your distributor, and then the distributor deals with the Pop TVs and the Netflix. Correct. And all those guys, right?
Yeah, that's exactly how it works. So when we had Schitt's Creek and other shows too, one of the first relationships we start to build out is the international side of it. Who will represent the series internationally to buyers at the markets around the world.
One of the things that struck me watching Schitt's Creek and reading the background is that it really reminded me of an old TV show that I used to watch when I was a kid, which was a long time ago, called Green Acres. And in Green Acres, as I'm sure you recall, the Douglases were successful lawyers in New York and then moved to the country. So it was, and dealt with all of the stuff in small towns that they had to deal with, the Mr. Haney's and Drucker's General Store and all the stuff that happened in Hootersville. So it strikes me that Schitt's Creek is kind of like Green Acres, except not volitional, right? Like Johnny Rose and the family didn't have much to do with it. Do you see an overlap between that sort of Green Acres world and the Schitt's Creek world?
Yeah, definitely. I don't think you're the first to make that comparison, because exactly what you said, that's what it was. And it also struck something with audiences, something about kind of going back to a small town. Somehow we're all connected to small towns, whether it's present day or it's a generation or two ago. There is something about that resonates deeply. And somehow going to the town of Schitt's Creek and meeting the people and really seeing how close and tight knit and kind of simple it was, there's something there, and there's heart there, and there's community and family, there's love, and audiences really connected with it, not just in Canada as we know now, but in the US and around the world.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting to see the relationship between the values of the small town and the values of the Rose family when they go to the small town. And I think in my reading, it seems like Dan Levy, who came up with the concept, was really struck by the idea of, okay, I've been watching a lot of reality television. I see these rich people who are egocentric and narcissistic and delusional and rude and crude in some cases. What would they be like if their money was taken away from them? And what if they went to a small town and had to live in that small town, given their personalities and their value systems, and how that would wash up against a small town? And that really seems to be at the core of the show, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Living in a small town after having lost everything. It would be a different story if they were in the small town still with their money, but their whole, all the layers, all of the veneer that they had built up in that rich and extravagant life had to be peeled off. And kind of it is a show about rediscovering family, rediscovering the simple things. And Dan and Eugene came up with such a brilliant way to explore that. We learned a lot. And I think, the other thing too is when, the show did have a real run up for the first, the first 5 seasons, but it really was, we did 6 seasons. The last season landed during the pandemic, at the start of the pandemic, which was when we were all locked down. We were all in our homes. All, we had was, our lives became very, very small almost overnight. And I think audiences really connected at that time too. It became a show that spoke to people, a world in crisis, but also a world that was asked to live in very simple and small ways. And having those two, the event of, the beginning of the pandemic where we were locked down, and the arrival of season 6 of Schitt's Creek, there was just something very interesting and special there that the world connected to. And that's what, ultimately sort of led to us experiencing a run of a TV show that very few TV shows, if any, have ever experienced before.
Well, and you were really lucky with the pandemic in the sense too, that in season 6, that's when the character arcs really turn towards understanding that what they need to have is connections with one another as a family and connections with the community. And that's what keeps them together, because previously in the show, especially in the first couple of seasons, with the exception of maybe Johnny Rose, they haven't made that connection. They haven't understood that they need real friends and real people, and not just social media pals or people that you pick up the tab for at the Waverly, right? Exactly.
And you see that in the community, but also of Schitt's Creek, but you also see it when former friends or former members of their social circles enter into the world, and it's so awkward, and it amplifies kind of the shallowness of those worlds that they were living in.
So let's talk a little bit about the Roses, and talked about the character arc. That it strikes me that in terms of how a character changes from the beginning of a story to the end of the story, Johnny Rose's character arc is less severe than the other characters. I think he, from the very beginning, is a very loving guy, a very trusting guy, obviously, with his business manager who screws him over, and somebody who really values family and values relationships. And he stays pretty steady. He's sort of the steady rock through the family, and holds true to that. Whereas the other characters really have a lot to learn. right? And it's to me, it's watching them learn in relationship to the lessons that Johnny's already learned that really is a great contrast and really helps you have an anchor to see how far away the other family's members are from that sort of central spine of core values, right?
He really just keeps that family on course, sort of against all these powerful forces. Somehow he does it, and he's trying to highlight the importance of family and those connections. And, he's really the one who kind of embraces the community of Schitt's Creek first. But, with that speech you mentioned, and I believe that's the finale of season 2, but also, you see from the beginning, there is some endearment towards Roland, which, Roland as a person never in a million years would enter their previous lives' social circles, but there is a special bond there. And Johnny is there. It takes time, but he really steers the Rose family ship in the direction where they learn to embrace and appreciate the simpler parts of life and the more important parts of life. So he's the captain of that. And again, it's sort of like it isn't an against all odds voyage that they're on, but Johnny's there keeping them on track the whole way through.
And I think that the David character, the son, is also on an interesting arc, although much like Johnny, you see early on that he's lonely and he's this sort of odd introvert extrovert kind of character who really bonds with Stevie, the woman that runs the motel. And you can really see that relationship starting early. And again, a beautiful arc to the end where they have a real strong understanding of who each of them is and are very supportive of one another, although it doesn't turn into in the end, a romantic relationship, right?
I sometimes try and think about whose arc kind of came the furthest in that show in terms of the characters, but David's character certainly did. You look at him in the earlier episodes where there was this elite view of the world and a lot of self-centeredness, but it just that kind of just peels away over the seasons where he learns to love and he learns to kind of love himself too and open up his heart, which he was a very closed off character at the beginning. That character comes a long way in the show. And that's those last couple of episodes in season 6 and the final season. It's very hard not to get emotional in the relationship with him and Patrick, but also the relationship with him and Stevie too. Those are two very powerful relationships. And the Stevie relationship was a slow burn over the entire series. And we saw her grow and come out of her shell, definitely highlighted in the cabaret episode. But Patrick too. Patrick was he's almost more connected, almost sort of more aligned with Johnny's sensibility, kind of grounded and focused and kind of knows where he wants to go and helped David get to where he needed to be.
The Patrick and David story is really good. And obviously the show has gotten a lot of accolades and understandably for its portrayal of that gay relationship is very, very strong. Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's pull the camera back a bit and talk about Canadian small towns in general as they're portrayed in television, because it strikes me that if you look at something like the success of Letterkenny or the Trailer Park Boys, for example, and with Letterkenny in particular, you've got another small town depiction of Canadian town, and the Trailer Park guys, Bubbles and the gang, are depicted as rural characters in Canada. And all of those shows in their different ways have had some success internationally. What do you think the appeal is about that Canadian rural presentation that is so appealing internationally?
That's a good question. I can only kind of speak from my experience with it. Those are two very successful shows that you're pointing to in Trailer Park Boys and Letterkenny. I think it still just comes down to the simplicity of life in those communities where it's real. There are real genuine friendships. People are looking out for each other. They work and live in close proximity to each other. And there's just something simple and pure and honest about it. But the other thing, and this is something that as a production company, what we try and think about a lot when we look at shows that we want to support. We specialize in comedy, so the show needs to be funny and make us laugh. But what we really look for is a very specific sensibility or a very specific point of view. But at the same time, there's a universality to it that people can connect to. And I think when you're looking at themes of family and friendship and love and those sort of really basic themes of human existence, where you don't get muddied up or it doesn't get clouded is in these smaller communities where that's sort of the way of life, and it's nice, and your neighbors, and you walk down the street and you recognize everybody and have the opportunity to talk to everybody. And there are community events that bring everyone together. There's something just really, really nice about that. And it's a way to explore themes and a way to explore specific themes that actually connect to the universal.
I wanted to wrap up by going back to Green Acres, because Green Acres was part of I don't know what you call it, a Hooterville cinematic universe, right? You had Petticoat Junction and right. Green Acres and the Beverly Hillbillies all existed in that weird world, a sort of surreal world around Hootersville. And there were obviously spin-offs from that show. And Letterkenny has now got a show, Shoresy, that's a spin-off from Letterkenny. Is there any sense that any of the characters in Schitt's Creek are going to spin off into different shows?
That's a good question. And it's really a question for Dan. We know there's demand for this, and we know that people really want, people became so invested in those characters and fell in love with the characters, and they became part of their lives and cultural experience. But at the same time, there's something quite beautiful about not checking in on them again and not finding out where they are. We've kind of just left them in the space where we left them. And it's kind of up to us to think about where they ended up and where they're going and how they're doing. So I don't know. When, I've had conversations with Dan where we had talked about, this is something that can go a lot longer if we wanted to, but both he and Eugene, I really feel they got it right. And it's like, something like this, you want to have it end in a beautiful place. And if they do decide to bring it back, I'm sure it will be done in a great and wonderful way. But like I said, there is some beauty in kind of not knowing too, and just letting our imaginations paint that picture for us.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. So, Andrew, thank you very much for spending time with us. And in the spirit of the show, kindest regards.
Thank you so much. It was a real pleasure. Thank you, Wayne.
That was Andrew Barnsley, now working as both the head of his own production company and the president of the Toronto Film School. Now it's time for a short conversation about living responsibly on our planet, brought to you by Orowheat Organic Bread, great taste that's sustainably baked. Victoria Bick is head gardener for the historic garden for Dundurn Castle in Hamilton, Ontario. That means she carries on the work started by William Reed, the gardener that was there when Sir Allan Napier McNab was lord of the castle in the 1800s. Amazingly, Bick is still growing the same varieties of flowers, vegetables, and herbs Reed did. In Reed's time, that 2 acres of produce sustained the 18 residents of the castle. These days, Bick keeps the garden thriving to sustain interest in the gardening heritage of centuries past. Here's my conversation with Victoria as we strolled the pathways of a castle's garden. So, Victoria, we're in the historic kitchen garden for Dundurn Castle. Can you tell me a little bit about who would have been in the castle, how many people would be feeding from this garden, and how big the garden is?
Absolutely. So this is the home of Sir Allan Napier McNab, who's an early Prime Minister of Canada. He's serving from 1854 to 1856. And so this house was built in 1832 and was the home to his family. So his wife, his sister-in-law, he's got 3 daughters, and then a whole pile of servants doing all the work needed to run the household. The garden that we're in right now is about 1.4 acres. The original is actually located on the site of the original garden, but the original would have been about 2 acres. So one of our fences should be pushed farther back.
So you've already got stuff growing. I noticed there's some brick coal frames over there. Those kind of coal frames would have been around at the time?
Oh, absolutely. So that's really simple but really effective technology. So it's a brick structure with window panes on top, which let the light in, capture the heat. And so it allows us to extend the season by almost a month in either direction. So we used it early this spring to start all of our cold hardy vegetables. So brassicas, so cabbages, kale, kohlrabi, broccoli, all those good things, as well as some onions and some flowers like nasturtiums. And we're transplanting them out right now. So they're transitioning from the sort of protected greenhouse environment out into the garden proper.
Well, you've already got, I'm just saying, you've got some sorrel here and some garlic coming up there.
Egyptian onions, so very similar. They're a multiplier onion, also called walking onions or leaping onions, because they've got a tendency, right now they're making sort of bulbs on the top of them, and those bulbs are about to tip over and land, and they'll replant themselves. So they leap around the garden.
Right, right beside the strawberries.
Yes, right? Oh my, they're going to be so good.
There were 6 family members, 12 servants, so that's 18 people in the home on a regular basis, or the castle on a regular basis, and then guests and stuff. So all of those people would have been fed out of this garden?
Yeah, for all of their fruit, vegetable, herbs, and floral needs. All of it's coming out of the garden itself.
So we talked a little bit about what's in the garden. What else is growing here?
We grow, I hate to say it, we grow everything. So if you can name it, we're going to grow it. So we've got apple trees, pear trees, we've got tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, ground cherries, okra. We've got all the root vegetables, so carrots, potatoes, onions, turnips, radishes, salsify, scorzonera. We grow artichokes and cardoon. We grow beans and lettuce and spinach. Really, we grow everything because that's what they needed. If they need their flavorings, if they need their root vegetables, if they need their starches, it's all coming from the garden.
Wow. So did McNab have a good working relationship with the gardener here? Reed, I think his name was?
Yeah, William Reed. They had a fantastic relationship as far as we could tell. McNab's family was from Perthshire, Scotland, which is the same place that William Reed immigrated from, actually. And Reed was a very effective garden manager. We actually have records of all the different awards that he won at local horticultural societies and agricultural fairs. And as we're actually walking around the garden right now, and this red brick house that you can see over the fence just at the corner of the garden, that was built for William Reed by McNab. Shouldn't say by McNab. McNab had someone build it. He's not building it himself, but it's about 2.5 times the size of the average house in Hamilton at the time. So if we can use the house that McNab gifts to Reed as a metaphor for their relationship, it was pretty good.
The stuff that you're growing now, are these the same varieties that would have been grown at the time well, not back then, it would have been heritage varieties, but it is now, right?
Yeah. So back then they would have been the newest and most exciting recent developments in agriculture, but today we call them the heritage or the heirloom varieties. Yeah, so we actually are able to use the historic seed catalogs to know what was being grown and what was available in Hamilton in our time period. The one we love the most is actually from the RBG, the Royal Botanical Gardens archives. And it's the Bruce catalog from 1862. So we actually know that they were growing the Prince Albert potato here, the early large red tomato, the giant Cape gooseberry ground cherry. We know the name varieties, and thankfully seed-saving organizations mean that those varieties are still around today, so we're able to purchase seeds for those and plant them in the garden.
That's amazing. And one of the things I noticed we passed by is you've got some hops growing over there, right? So that was used for making beer here, right?
Yes, that was used for flavoring beer. It's also being used as a sleep aid. So if you can put those into sachets with lavender, and it's helpful. The scent of it is helpful for falling asleep with.
So the other folks in Hamilton, because there was a lot of properties around here, sort of, that the ordinary folks would have had, would they be growing stuff in their gardens? And what would those gardens be like? Because they didn't have lawns then, right?
Correct. Yeah, the lawn is a fairly modern thing. I mean, it comes into fashion during the Victorian period because it is a great waste of resources. It's a great way to show that you've got the space to grow not food, because you don't need to, but to grow something purely ornamental. But yeah, so the average person in Hamilton would not have a lawn. And in this neighborhood, we've got a lot of the original workers' cottages. You can see there's small houses on tight lots. But if you've got access to land, you'd have a garden. So this is one of the things that would have been incredibly common in Hamilton. People supplementing their incomes and their diets with food that they're growing themselves. So generally, that is women's work at the time, which is managing household finances and food. And so they would be growing whatever they could. Sometimes it's actual food, like fruits and vegetables. We've got records of people also growing flowers, of growing medicinal herbs, of growing things just for the nice of it. But yeah, a lot of people had gardens.
So the McNab family were sustained by this garden. People in the community were sustained by their own gardens. What do you suggest for people today who want to eat out of their own gardens, start gardening in their own backyards?
Oh my goodness, just try stuff. Just get out there and get your fingers in the soil and try stuff. Something might die, you might have rabbits come by, squirrels are a menace to beans, but you don't know until you try it, and the joy of growing something is absolutely amazing. Even if it's just a little handful of spring peas or 2 heads of lettuce, but when you have something coming from your own garden, it's a really special experience.
What is the feedback you get from folks who come to Dundurn Castle and come through this garden and see what this was like back then?
I mean, our most common question is, are those costumes hot? So I want to invite your visitors to please never ask a gardener if the costume is hot. It is, trust us. But people are amazed by the space. It's a huge garden that's unlike many others because it's a kitchen garden. It's about vegetable and flower production. So it looks different than a lot of other gardens. And there's always something blooming. There's always something fruiting. There's always something of interest. And the things we grow here, you won't find many other places.
And you love doing this.
Yeah, just a little.
Okay, Victoria, thanks very much for showing us around.
Absolutely, thanks for coming.
That was Victoria Bick, the Historical Kitchen Garden Supervisor of the Dundurn National Historic Site. So, here we are at the end of this episode of Harrowsmith Radio. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please consider subscribing to this podcast at Apple Podcasts or in your favorite podcast player. And please tell your friends and family. Got feedback? We'd love to hear it. You can email us at letters@harrowsmithmag.com. That URL, harrowsmithmag.com, is also where you can order subscriptions online. And you can find Harrowsmith Magazine on newsstands of selected stores across Canada. Until next time, for Harrowsmith Radio, I'm Wayne McPhail. And also, until next time, remember these 4 words: make, grow, sustain, share. Tune in for the next episode of Harrowsmith Radio.